Well, good evening, everyone. And I am really delighted to be here with my friend Elizabeth Garner, who is a novelist, an editor, and a deep thinker about the nature of story. Her novel Night Dancing won a Society of Authors Betty Trask Award and was shortlisted for the Pendleton May First Novel Award. Her second novel, The Ingenious Edgar Jones, a historical fiction fantasy based in Victorian Oxford, was published in both Britain and the USA to critical acclaim. The New York Times praised its transformative prose. Both of those wonderful novels draw their inspiration from folk tales, and now, as you know, she has returned to the source with this absolutely gorgeous book, which is gorgeous inside and out, and also has the most magnificent illustrations by Phoebe Connolly. Are you doing anything with, I'm just curious, are you doing events? Anything with Phoebe?
Nothing planned as yet, but
I hope I get to meet her.
Yeah, I think this is a work in progress.
This is such a beautiful book. Ethna Farry in the Daily Mail called it beguiling, saying there's a lovely incantatory rhythm to the telling, whatever the mood or emotion experienced, from mischievous glee in a contest won in the wits of the Whetstone, to supernatural unease in the twisted oak, to malice aplenty in Little Stupid. I feel very lucky to be here with Liz to talk about a subject that is very dear to both of our hearts and that we have spent a lot of time talking about. Not least, I was remembering as I was coming here, days and days spent at Beyond the Border, immersing ourselves in story. So It's really wonderful to be here to talk to you about this marvelous book. So please give a round of loud applause. There's a marvelous introduction to this by our friend Hugh Lupton, who says, "It is the job of each generation to make the old tales speak afresh. And in this collection, Elizabeth Garner has fashioned a vibrant web," which is lovely praise from Hugh. Let's start at the beginning of the tale. You have lived with these stories in various forms so much of your life. Maybe start by telling us how they informed your childhood, your imagination, and how you knew the time was right to tell them, some of them, yourself.
I think they've just always been part of me. You know, there are 15 tales in here, and the reason for the collection, my selection process, really was just the ones that I loved. That was a starting point. And many of those were tales that I loved as a child, but some of them were also tales that I'd heard told by oral storytellers that we know, you know, at Beyond the Border and at various other events. And I think if I had to choose one tale from all of these that always stayed with me, it's the story of the Black Bull of Norroway, which I've rewritten as the Black Bull's Bride, which I just absolutely loved it as a kid, and I loved it for all its strangeness and seemingly odd, contradictory detail. So, and it's a love trial. It's a complex love trial, I suppose. If you were going to draw a sort of common parallel, as it's a bit of a Beauty and the Beast story, but it's much more than that. It has
a little bit of Tamlin in it.
Yeah,
I feel of the sort of sticking. Someone who sticks true to someone.
Yes, yeah.
Despite their outward appearance.
Yeah. It's a youngest of three sisters who each have their desired suitor to come and claim them from their cottage. And the first sister gets a prince in a golden carriage, second sister, prince in a silver carriage, third sister, bloody great big black bull. And off they go, and things happen. And I think it's partly because I was one of three sisters, and still am one of three sisters, and I was known to sit at the gate at the top of the field in my parents' house, and just sit there, waiting for the bull. Didn't come. Lots of other things did, but not the book.
But it fascinated me to read, so that there are 15 stories in this book, and then notes at the end, which are a wonderful mix of the kind of personal and the scholarly about the sources of the tales and your feelings about them. I think just to focus on that story, it did fascinate me that was what you said was your favorite as a child, because aside from sitting at the bottom of the field waiting, it's quite a complicated story.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the most sort of intricate. I mean, they're all intricate, but it really is a kind of tightly woven story. And I guess that leads me to the question of how these kinds of stories are perceived to be, you can hear the quotation marks in my voice, for children. Yet I feel, and I think you feel, that they are one of the ways in which younger human beings come to understand the world.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't say that this was a book for children in the sense of written with that readership in mind. But then I also am a great believer, like, what is a children's book? I don't actually think that definition necessarily should exist. I mean, one of the things that I talk about a lot is the fact that when I was growing up, my father, the author Garner, and my mother, a teacher and librarian, Griselda Garner, had a wealth of books in their house, and none of them were ever forbidden. For me and my siblings, we could read whatever we wanted from Dad's research library or from the books that Mum was reviewing. I do joke with them about that. I'm pretty sure that when I was of a young age, there were some books that were put on high shelves. I'm sure some members of the audience can identify with that. You have to go tall enough to get to the shelf. But that idea of nothing being forbidden, if myself or any of my siblings were curious, we could take a book, we could read it, but the only caveat was that we had to sort of show what we were reading and then talk about it. And as a result, that's how I encountered some of the Jacob's tales were from my parents' library. And the tale that I absolutely loved as a child, again, was the Hobby Hours, which I've rewritten. This is Little Dog Turpie. And it's really pretty dark. The Hobby Hours they have a brilliant time, but woe betide anyone who comes near them in their hemp field. Dogs get chopped up, old men and women get gobbled up. But I loved it, and I think part of it was because as a child there's some sort of glee in that, but also it was all contained within the story. And in fact, in my retelling of it, I made it a little more, although it's sort of extended, so that the gobbling and the chopping up is quite graphic. It's also given a circularity that's not there in the original, where there's a sense of sort of closure or redemption. The dog comes back to life. In the original, the dog's just gone. I should stop talking about chopping up dogs and gobbling people.
I don't think you should. Keep at it, I say. Because I agree with you. Because, darkness fascinates us all, and it's one of the ways in which, I may be speaking out of turn here, but I'm always a little puzzled, and certainly all of these stories would have them. Neil Gaiman did a book, I think, called Trigger Warning.
Yeah.
What we encounter in stories, in art, is what helps prepare us for the difficult things that we may indeed encounter in life. So that the chopping up of dogs and body parts is an imaginative act out into a difficult world. And one of the things you say, I think in your introduction, the stories you found as a child enriched the landscape and helped you travel beyond that.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little more on that?
I think because I was highly imaginative, obviously that's now worn off. So, and I think it was also kind of growing up in the countryside in quite an isolated environment. So there was a feeling that these tales were also of the land that I was exploring as a child, of the forests and of that element. But also through placing these tales within this sense of landscape, it also enabled me to reimagine and move into different worlds. But I think also, going back to what I was saying about the darkness and the sort of structure, there's always a reason, you know. So going back to the Hobbyars story, I really looked at that kind of folktale motif of what happens when you call something across a boundary, what happens when you make a wish made in a moment of anger, and things like that. And I think this is what these tales do. They prepare us for the world outside, but they also are very complex studies of morality. In a way, the language may seem deceptively simple, or the cause and effect may seem quite simple, but you just dig a little deep, and I think these are tools for living, I think. And within that, I don't mean set morality tales of, you know, don't go into the wood because bad things happen. I think it's a bit more complicated than that.
Yes, I think it's more complicated than that. So there are 15 tales out of hundreds, if not thousands, that you have both read and heard. Mm-hmm. How did you get to these 15?
I originally had a selection. I kind of started off with, I think it was about 40, but I knew that I didn't want it to be that kind of big compendium book. I wanted it to be, always wanted it to be 15. And this is maybe also partly my background. I trained as a film script editor back in a different life. So I'm very sort of led by structure. So it had to be a number that you could divide by 3. And it also, to then have a sort of sense of the rhythm and the placement of the tales. And then it was a matter of almost finding a kind of a range of tone across them. That was important, because I didn't want them all to be, dark or all to be playful. And then once I started, the first 5 or 6 were really easy to decide upon. And once I had them, it was a matter of what balances those out. What's a kind of call and response? So there's a couple of I suppose you could say fables in there. But also what happened quite quickly was I got really interested in this idea of weaving the world of the stories together. So you have echoes and allusions to other tales or objects from other tales that pop up in them. And once I started doing that, the selection process sort of made itself. But, you know, I've got some others in the notebooks, so you never know.
Another 15.
You never know.
How, because you talk about, in the notes, there are these recurring motifs that sometimes you've changed elements of a story to pick up a motif. Like, I think the apple tree in the story that I first knew as the Peddler of Swaffham becomes an oak.
Yes, that's right.
And picks up the twisted oak.
Yes.
You know, I guess my question is, how did you know, I use this word advisedly, for your own sake, sort of when that was allowed and when it was not, when it was going a step too far? Because, for instance, you say in the notes to the Black Bull's Bride that you found these Norwegian proverbs that connected to the story, but it was too much to like try and work them in? How did you know what the kind of boundary of the story was?
I think there are two different things there, because I think with the boundary of the story, that's really clear to me. And other people can rewrite folktales and do much stronger things with me. But I felt it was really important to be true to the perimeters of the story. So not essentially change what happens to characters, not fundamentally change where it happens. So, for example, there's a Baba Yaga story in there. Now, that could only be set in the pine forest. It couldn't be set in the orchard. It just that I couldn't do that, and I couldn't change the innate nature of characters. But what I was really interested in was looking at motivation and why these stories played out in the way they did. So I would sort of possibly dig into the why a little bit more, and try and think about these stories as characters and as people that were experiencing it rather than archetypes. So I guess the easiest example of that is the Riddles of the Crossroads story, which I turned into Jack the Trickster's first story. It's based partly on a medieval ballad, and also there are folktale sources of it, sometimes Jack, sometimes other characters. And I just really expanded that to think about what makes Jack Jack. If this is his first story and his first adventure, what does he learn? And how does that make him the trickster? And how does that make him the character that lives in the present?
So in a sense, he then gets a kind of character arc.
Yes, he does.
Through the book.
Because there are 3 Jack stories in there, and yes, no spoilers, but the last story is Jack's last story. And then I guess the other thing you're saying about changing the motif, so changing the apple tree in Swatham to an oak tree, I felt that was okay, because I'd already written another story where something was buried in the roots of an oak tree. So I sort of wanted to play with that, but I didn't change essentially what was found or the consequences of that.
Also, I mean, these are stories that come from an oral tradition, a tradition of tradition and change, tradition and development. What is eternal is immutable. You have spent a lot of time listening to stories as well as reading them. Yeah. This is a complicated question. What's the difference? How did you approach that difference? Because you must have had voices ringing in your head as well as words on the page. That's a really interesting question. I wasn't... when I first started putting this collection together, I honestly wasn't sure that I could do it. And I don't mean that in any self-effacing way. I just didn't know if I had my own way through this material, because I'd absorbed and listened to it so much. And what surprised me was how clear and strong the voice that came out. You know, it's my writing voice, but it's a slightly different voice to the novels because these are compact. You know, they're dense. So the way I approached it was that I did the research first. So I looked a lot at Catherine Briggs' collection. There's also other references in the bibliography. And then I actually approached it with my script editing brain, which was just to find the 3 acts in the story. And then I looked at all the different variations and found the points that interested me. And sometimes those points were little anomalies. Quite often, especially when I was working through the Catherine Briggs material,
it was the story where the character had a name. So, for example, in the Changeling story, she's called Tibby, and that's because in one of the Briggs oral sources, it was like this farmer's wife over there, and her name was Tibby. And whenever I found a character as a source with a name, that was something that I found quite comforting in a way.
Because it seemed particular, individual?
Yeah, I guess so. So then, so I'd look at all the sources, and I'd find the points that interested me, and then I would sort of find the basic construction of the story. So, for example, in the Changeling story, it's your standard, changeling, child swapped from another child, changed into dispatched, child returned. And in the variations, it's almost always a tailor that managed to defeat the changelings. Not always, but almost always. And then I just thought about the consequences. You know, there's always consequences if you meddle with other folk or the folk from there. And I found a fragment in Briggs of a story of a tailor being charmed into a field by a blue light and trapped. No, that's right. He's trapped in this field, going up and down the field by this blue light until he's exhausted. So I sort of took that, but had the tailor completely disappear after defeating the changeling. And then in another variation, one of the Jack stories, is a bit where Jack goes to bargain with St. Peter at the gates, and he's not let in, but there's a little refrain of a tailor, a small thin tailor slipped in like a thread through a needle, and I thought, I hope it's the same tailor, so I put him in there.
That the Changeling story has the wonderful title of Johnny He Not. I really love that. I'm fascinated by Changeling stories because I was told I was one by my parents. Which is a kind of interesting thing to grow up with, actually, that they took the wrong baby from the hospital. So they have always fascinated me for that reason. I didn't know until I read one of my favourite Changeling stories, is Maurice Sendak's Outside Over There.
Yes, yeah.
And I hadn't, and there are eggs and eggshells in that, and I hadn't thought. Tell us a little bit about the because there are eggshells.
Yes. There's the calling out the changeling by brewing beer in an eggshell. That's the first thing. Although what's fascinating, again, and a lot of these are not just my stories. You know, I have my absolute debt to the oral storytellers I encountered, but also a dear friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Tim Campbell-Green, who's an archaeologist up at Blackton, has done a lot of research on rituals of found objects and folklore ritual in mainly in Cheshire and Derbyshire, but sort of around the area. And a lot of the little details in these folk tales connect with finds of ritual objects or found folklore. And in fact, he sent me something just the other day that I will not paraphrase, but it was a detail of how a new child was brought into the home and welcomed into the home in, I think it was the 15th century, and there was a ritual in there about breaking eggshells at the threshold and actually walking on the eggshells to walk the child into the house.
Into the house.
And then you think of what we say now about walking on eggshells. It's like, what don't know, what if? But I guess, actually probably looping back to the question you asked before about the connections and my own adaptations, I guess where I felt comfortable, because I'm not an academic, you know, I'm a writer, and from that research and finding those variations, one of the things that I would do was just kind of play around in what I call the what if spaces. That, you know, maybe the Black Bull of Norway is a story that came from Norway to Scotland. Maybe not. There's lots of variations on it in other cultures, so maybe not. But I thought there was enough of a what if there to then set the quest that the Black Ball and his bride go on in a landscape that's quite like Norway.
Yes.
And that's not specified in the originals at all.
But it has that echo here. And there are Russian themes in this book, not just Baba Yaga. One of the well, they're all wonderful, but I'm fascinated, and we were discussing a story which is called Little Stupid.
Yes.
So, another great title, and I'm fascinated. Tell us about that story and what it means that Little Stupid never loses this extraordinary moniker.
Yeah, I first discovered it in Old Peter's Russian Tales, and in fact the illustration of the cover design is taken from Phoebe's wood engraving of the Little Stupid story. And again, it's the youngest of three sisters. There we go, and it's your classic, tormented by her older sisters. Mother's dead, and the father is a merchant. And when he goes to the fair, he asks his daughters what they want for him to bring back. And the older sister wants a golden gown, middle sister, sapphire necklace. And the younger sister, Little Stupid, asks for a transparent apple in a silver saucer. And the reason she's called Little Stupid is in the Asneaf original, she's just called Fool. But she's called Fool and Stupid by her siblings because they think she's naive and trusting. So what I did with the sort of unpacking of that was think about her naivety isn't naivety at all, actually. She has an understanding of the power of that object of the apple and the saucer, the power of vision, and I read that, a very early draft of that actually, to my goddaughter Lila, who is not little and not stupid, but very fervent in her investigation of myth and folktale. And she would have been about 7 at the time. And she was outraged that Little Stupid's name didn't change. And she said, why are they still allowed to call her that? And I had to think a lot about that. And I said, no, because she turns what they see as stupidity into wisdom and insight and compassion. So
it's a kind of honesty.
It's a country, yeah.
Fascinating. I want to. I don't want to just be the only one talking and asking questions. If you have any questions, shout them out. Raise your hand. Know that you can speak. Anybody, or think about them. I'll open this idea. Yes.
There seems to be a bit of a resurgence in interest in folk and myth. I'm thinking of writers like Andrew Michael Hurley and Francine too. Susanna Clarke as well.
Yeah.
I think. Why do you think that's happening now? Do you think it's triggered by something particular?
I don't know. It's very interesting, isn't it? Because the time that it takes to write a book and get it out into the world, that's quite a long time frame. But I think you're absolutely right. I think this has just hit at a particular time, and I don't know. It's very hard for me to answer that because I've always loved this kind of material. But I wonder, possibly as the outside world gets more uncertain and terrifying, that actually
unmanageable.
Yeah, that going back to these old stories and these old tools for living, as a comfort. I mean, there is a publisher in the audience. Any idea, John? Why folk tales are coming back? Any sense?
Well, I think they never really go away today. I mean, I think they get reformulated. If you, on some level, the massive amount of money that's been sunk in the Marvel universe is which is now kind of dominates the entertainment industry. Their roots in the deep roots are in folktale and story transformation. So, I mean, it's interesting. So I love this idea of tools for living. I'd love you to talk a little bit more about this is like a toolkit then, in a way, this book.
Yeah, it's
What are the tools?
how to chop up a dog, how to come back from the
Skills you
dead.
never knew you needed.
There's definitely a thing about getting in and out of things.
Yes, there
Yes.
is. Yeah. So I mean, it's. Yes, I think there's an element of how to find your way in the world. You know, what skills are needed for that. What qualities can be tried and tested. I mean, it's really interesting. So one of the tales that I wrote first was the Stealing the Moon story, which is based on a folktale motif, which is characters who see the moon in a body of water, in a well or in a lake, and think it's either made of silver or cheese, and they try and catch it. And there are, again, going back to Briggs, there are some variations where it's a Jack story, but it's a tiny fragment, well, not a tiny fragment, paragraph. And as I unpacked it, I just thought, who are the people that Jack tricks and why? And that's not there in any of the source materials. But I was very lucky to be taught by an amazing medieval tutor of mine at uni, of Helen Cooper, and I just remembered the amazing conversation we had about Chaucer, and I just thought, let's just have a little look at Chaucer. Let's have a little look at the Canterbury Tales, and because also, as any writer will tell you, that research process, that it's really good to just give yourself an excuse to go and read a book for a week and not write anything. And I thought of the idea of those characters representing particular values that were tested. And then that expanded the story for me. It was like, who are they? What do they represent? And how does Jack get them down the well? And I got that quite early on. And then I went back to this idea of Trickster Jack. You know, yes, he's there. He holds a mirror up to human nature. But also, he's not cruel. You know, he's not... I mean, there may be some stories where he is, but I haven't found them yet. And then I sort of threaded it back to think, okay, what if he was in desperate need, what items would he need? What items of clothing would he need to survive? And that's how I came up with the various characters. And I'll just read the end of it, because this is a story that since when I'm going to get all political now. When I wrote it, in terms of time frame, I thought, oh, that's a bit of a Brexit story. By the time it came out, actually, this is something that people, a couple of people picked up on and going, you know, this is a tale for our time. So everyone's down the well. Then Jack put on the sturdy boots, placed the axe at one side of his belt, the sword at the other, buttoned the long coat up to the collar, slipped the gold and ruby ring upon his finger, and set out. So these are all the articles of clothing that the characters down the well left by the side of the well. The smiling moon above lit the road ahead as Jack went on his way, whistling. And there we must leave the farmer, the woodcutter, the soldier, the merchant, and the bishop, whose folly blinded them to common sense, so that they only saw the world that they wanted to see. Whether they ever found a way to set aside greed, pride, vanity, cunning, and power in favour of the greater good, I do not know. Perhaps they are down there still, squabbling over a fortune as false as their hearts. Just saying.
Just saying. Quite a good evening to discuss that story, since there is such a remarkable moon overhead this evening. Anyone else? Doesn't have to be.
I was going to ask another question about they read really. I really love that you write them within the sort of the register of the traditional folktale. You're not you're not sticking lots of modern vocabulary and not modernising them. In this, it's very much still is in the folktale. Well, I just wondered how much the idea of having them performed or the orality of them was important to you. Did you find yourself reading them out loud?
Yeah, I mean that's
Still where we've got great storytelling.
Here.
At least one oral storyteller in the audience, but they do have for me. I can hear voices when I read them.
Yeah, there's lovely alliteration in them, and they sort of kick along.
Thank you.
When they get wrangles, there's some really great oral phrasing in them.
Oh, I learnt it from the best Ben. No, honestly, I did. So it's also no, I'm not joking. It just soaked in, and the alliteration, the emphasis, the careful placing of a metaphor. That's all stuff that I've learnt from Ben and the members of the Crick Crack Cup.
Kind of how to make a picture
Yes,
is one of the things.
I think how to make a picture with simple words, seemingly simple words, but enough space for, so with, again, going back to that, that description of the moon. I didn't need to say a smiling silver moon shining in the big night sky. It's just the smiling moon above. And that gives enough space for everyone to sort of put their own placement on it whilst it's still being accurate. And the alliteration again was something I got from storytellers, but also again actually going back to translations of Chaucer. I hate doing it, but no matter what I'm writing, when I'm at that editing stage where I know it's too wordy but I can't see it on the page anymore, I'll record it on my phone and listen to myself back, because that's the only way that I can spot it. And I would want these to be read aloud as well. They are not transcribed oral storytelling. Oral storytelling does something very different, but I wanted them to sit well in an environment where they were read aloud. Not least because, I was read folk tales loud as a child, and I also learnt to read from folk tales. So, again, really practical tools for living.
I love, if you'll allow me,
Yeah, go for it.
something that was the first appearance of the bull in the Black Bull's Bride. The mist was torn apart by a pair of pointed horns and a great snout set with a golden ring. A black bull was stood before her, hair-backed, wild-eyed, and stamping. And as you say, it's very simple language, but it puts the images before us in a way that can be followed in the ear as well as on the page. And the other thing I really admire in this book is, and you were talking a little bit before about character, is I think the way you've navigated from your kind of filmic editor's narrative viewpoint, the way you have thought about character and motivation without imposing those too much on the stories. Because to me, one of the wonder of folktales and ballads is how much room they leave for us to, and it's why we can return to them again and again and again, where you can hear a story when you're 20 and hear it again when you're 40 and 50, and there's enough room in the story.
Yes, you can have different
and yet
points
I
of
think
empathy.
you have thought about why are these people doing this, but without overstepping that into the words that want to come to mind, or sort of ghastly backstory, too much.
I mean, I think there are two things there. Firstly, it's not just the why are these people doing this. It's that sense of you can't, like as in folktale so in life, you can't go on a have an experience that takes you out of your known environment and makes you think about life differently and not be changed by it. So I mean, I think in the Little Sparrow story, that's something that I was looking at very carefully. That's the Baba Yaga story. The girl whose father marries again and marries a witch and is sent into the woods to go and meet her sister Baba Yaga, and comes back from the woods with full knowledge of the true nature of her stepmother, and it's got quite a strong ending to that one, because that's a rites of passage. You know, she has been made to think about her family differently, about her landscape differently. You can't not be changed by that. So I think there's that element. But going back to what you're saying about the film element, that I think I was also really informed in all my writing from working on film scripts and on film sets, where there's such a visual storytelling language. So that first description of the bull, I really thought about that. You know, I thought, okay, it's Misty and she's sitting on a doorstep. What's she going to see first? That reveal is going to come in that order because of where she is sitting, and I've been known to just wander around the house, looking at things from different angles and trying to work out, what would it look like. So with the Little Stupid and the glass apple, it's a scrying object, and it's based on a glass apple that my godmother Patricia Elliott gave me, and I spent loads of time just sitting by the fire, looking into it, and trying to see how easy it was to turn, what firelight looked like when you turn it different ways. None of that description is on the page, but it's there in my inhabiting the story. Yeah,
I think, to me, that's true of, all the best storytelling is people moving in the world. And there's a wonderful Desert Island Discs with Colm Toynbee. And it's Kirsty Young still then who asks him about the themes of his novels, how he thinks about the themes of his novels. And he says in his wonderful Irish accent that there's nothing like a theme to kill a novel stone dead. And what he is interested in, and I think this is the image, is how someone picks a glass of water up off a table and puts it back down again. And the themes are not his problem, nothing to do with him. And again, I think because folktales, they are action, they are image, they are event. So to me, they're the kind of distillation of that. Why? It's an important question. Why Lost and Found?
Oh, because a variety of reasons, really. I think partly just through the process of pulling together the collection, it was this idea of some stories that they'd always been there, but I'd sort of forgotten details within them or forgotten what an effect they had on me. So that was the process of kind of digging into that material and finding new connections in them, but also within the tales themselves. They are mainly stories of loss and recovery, of a character going on a journey, having lost something, seeking something out. Often what they find is not necessarily what they sought. There's also a strong motif of that with the power of the objects within the folk tales, discovered objects or discovered rituals, and yeah, I think that's a good answer.
One of the Lost and Found, it's always been one of my favourite tales, is the one you call Roots of Fortune.
Oh yes, yeah.
Which also is interesting because, as you then discovered, it is attached to an actual person.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that story and the different ways in which you came to it?
I first heard that story being told by Hugh Lupton, who wrote the foreword. So I actually always knew it was connected to Swatham, and I was kind of always fascinated by the so it's a peddler. Gosh, I really always hate summarising stories, and especially when you've got a storyteller in the audience. There we go. But basically, he's a peddler called John Chapman, who has a dream to go to London Bridge, so where he'll find his fortune. And he goes to London Bridge, and nothing. He spends 3 days there, and on the third day, and I think I'll try and get it verbatim. I think it's in the Briggs and the versions. A gentleman comes up to him and says, asks him if he's got anything to sell or if he's begging, and John Chapman goes no. And the gentleman says, what is the purpose of this entirely fruitless standing? Which I think is a brilliant phrase that we should just all use a lot more. And
we should just do it a lot more. Entirely
I'm
fruitless
really
standing.
good at fruitless standing. I mean, it's great. And so John Chapman tells the gentleman of his dream, and the gentleman says to John Chapman, well, you know, I think it's even the phrase, you poor country-voiced fellow, that he says, you know, if we paid attention to dreams, we'd all have no direction in our life. And he tells John Chapman of a dream that he had of a shack in a village called Swatham with an apple tree in the garden and treasure hidden in the roots, which is, of course, John Chapman's home, and he goes back and digs and finds the treasure. So that, and he was known within the village. There's a carving of him on one of the pews in the local church in Swatham, and in fact Phoebe based the illustration for the story of that carving on that carving. And so I guess what I did with that story was take that known structure of it and then think a bit more about the nature of the treasure and what it was found in, and base that on kind of medieval burial urns. And I then also just slightly expanded this idea of what was the fortune? You know, was this something that he had a right to take or not? And in the church in Swatham, it's got one of those beautiful angel rafters, carved angel rafters, which are also attributed to a donation from John Chapman. So at the end of the story, I just had this. Read it. Might as well. It's here. It's very short. Because I think this is another really nice example of where the research, the truth, and the folk tale, sort of stretching the end of the folk tale, fits together. So yes, some folk say that the honest peddler crafted the angels of fortune in eternal thanks for their visitation in his dreams and their favour. Other folk say it was the devil himself who trapped the foolish traveller with a cache of cursed coin. They say that John Chapman set the angels upon the eaves in the hope that when his time came, they might show mercy and haul him up to the heavens, away from the fate and the fire that was surely his due. And that's again a motif in the book. We have this sense of fate. Where does fate sit in the scale of above and below? So there's a lot going on in there.
And I really love that little development, I want to say, of the ending of that story, of questioning whether we could know whether the treasure was an unalloyed good. You know, the treasure has layers, that there's a complexity to the finding of what we think we want or need.
And again, that's another motif. So I guess this goes back to your question about where are the parameters of playing with the story. You know, is the treasure a bounty or a curse? It's a very strong folklore motif. So kind of putting that in there seemed okay. And any other questions?
Any other questions?
Yes.
I wanted to touch briefly on what you said about formulae and layers. Have you ever considered the question about the very fine line between folklore and tale-telling and actual incantation? I wonder, because you've been talking a lot about intuition, the kind of collocations of words that sets off synapses in the brain, and we don't need to write them down for that to have an effect on the audience, or know that people automatically have conjured certain images in their minds by dint of, say, 3 words. It's a bit of an out there idea, but something I wondered about, in your opinion.
I think it's really interesting because I think that's actually kind of the experience of oral storytelling, you know, and if you haven't encountered it, it's quite hard to explain. If you haven't encountered it, go and see it at the Story Museum in Oxford, because it's quite a thing. That there's a sense of a land and a place being called into being in, you know, and it's not like using theatrical sets. It's just someone on a stage telling a story and taking you into that world. In terms of actual incantation of an other that we can call up into this world, I'm not really comfortable talking around that, because I don't have a solid belief system or an academic understanding of that. But what I would say is that so much of folk tales relies on repetition and alliteration, as we were talking about before, and the power of 3. You know, the third time, or the, you know, the third youngest son or youngest daughter, or the third time that a question is asked, it's answered, or the third time. I mean, it's there absolutely throughout the Black Bull's Bride. You know, the tests of 3 nights, 3 days, 3 nights. And I wonder, that's the best time bell ever, isn't it? Excellent. I just called a bell into being.
Exactly.
And I wonder whether that is connected somehow, connected to ritual, that there could have been that a story can come from a ritual experience. And again, this really ties on into the work that I'm doing with Tim Campbell Green, that we're hoping to explore a bit more. You know, he said quite early on when we were chatting that there's no way of knowing. For example, he works with caches of iron, caches that are found in timber frame, and he said there's no way of knowing what these were for. Were they protection? Were they warding off evil? And I was reminded of something actually that Hugh Lupton said years ago, that the best place to hide a secret is in a story, because people don't think, you know, maybe it's not real if it's in a story. So I don't know. That's a bit of a fuzzy answer to a really interesting question.
No, that's it's a very interesting way of tackling it. Thank you. My background is oral performance storytelling.
Right. Well, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah,
so,
yeah.
It's the same sort
Yeah.
of idea.
So I feel like I've just suddenly been really deeply patronising telling a storyteller to go and listen to stories. Sorry.
John.
Yeah, I don't know why I've never asked this before. I really love the Wit of the Whetstone story. And there's 2 things in it. One is, did you make up the hanging of the England child sign upside down?
Yeah.
I thought, because I've never come, it's such a brilliant image, and I thought, I'm sure I would have come across the turning upside down on the plus side is a brilliant way to start a sort of writers. I love that story.
Yeah.
It's got an innkeeper in it and a pub.
Yeah. I did slightly write that one for you, John, to be fair.
There is a source for the Sermon of the Malt.
Oh yes, yeah. No, everything. I mean that. I worked years and years and years ago, very briefly with a film writer, scriptwriter who went on to do great things. But he said that when he didn't know quite what to do, he'd just write himself into a corner. He would just get his character that he didn't really like and just write the most difficult thing possible. And with Wits of the Whetstone, I absolutely mined Briggs. I wish I brought my notebook with me, and looked at all the Follies tales and it's basically a grand line contest, which is again something that I experienced at the Crick Crack Cup and loved, where it's who can tell the biggest lie and how upset you get. But every little detail in there is a little fragment of Briggs, and I just wove it together. And then the sermon, yes, it's Reverend Dodd, the sermon of against the malt, was a puritanical preacher. And in fact, if I can find the reference really quickly, it was one of those things where I found a reference to it in Briggs, and then I found the original volume as well, which I tell you what, John, let's get that out and let's take it down the Falkland Arms and do a bit of preaching. It's a sermon on the word malt, preached in the stump of a hollow tree. And I took that, but it's not quite the same text. I took the MALT acronym and turned it into a sermon by the bishop within that context. But yes, the hanging, the pub sign, again, just came from that phrase in the song "The World Turned Upside Down," and I just thought, yeah, what would be a symbol of that? And then I went and took a photograph of the sign, "The Eagle and Child," and on my phone, and turned it upside down. It just looked brilliant. And then I made Phoebe engrave it, which she was very.
I think a discussion of malt and pubs is quite a good way to round off this evening. So thank you all for coming, but thank you so much, Liz, for sharing your stories and your thoughts about your stories with us.
Well, thank you for asking me such brilliant questions. Thank you.
She never came home again when the moon it went down. Oh, Filemd do grieve, and Oak do hate, but Willow, 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 Willow do walk if you travel